political realities have led to the unprecedented degradation of our planet and the triple planetary crisis on climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Governance and environmental multilateralism are key challenges for an efficient and successful approach to the triple crisis, and also, multilateralism has provided itself with a circular roadmap of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity conservation. We know the international community faced multiple challenges related to the concretization of the roadmaps, the integration on climate change, pollution, and biodiversity conservation policy horizontally, both in the public, private, and civil society sectors. Three, the vertical integration at all jurisdictional levels on climate change, pollution, and biodiversity conservation policy. And four, the integration of knowledge in decision makers. So this event was thinking to bring together representative of the three Rio conventions, public, private, and civil society sector, in order to analyze the issues and move toward common conclusions. We are very pleased to receive Susan Gardner, the Ecosystem Director of the UNEP, Mr. Tim Key, the new chair of the UPCC, Ligia Castro de Doens, in representation of the Minister Milcia de Concepcion, very welcome, Francisca Cortés Solari, our president of Philanthropy Cortés Solari, Mr. Christian Tyrell, the program officer of biodiversity and climate change of the CBD, and Charlotte Mogensen, who is watching us, I do espère, from Volux Foundation. So we are going to give the welcome and the floor to Mrs. Susan Gardner.
Well, thank you so much for convening this important discussion. In our common agenda of the Secretary General's publication, he called for more networked and inclusive multilateralism. And part of what he was talking about is exactly this kind of conversation where we bring the various conventions together to share experiences, to understand better how we collectively work across the UN system to provide support for member states, for all citizens, all communities. We need forms of more intense cooperation with other international and regional organizations through a networked multilateralism. That's what he called for in his speech. The Secretary General said we also need closer contacts with business, civil society, and other stakeholders for more inclusive multilateralism. And this is essential if we're actually going to rise to the challenges. The 2023 report on High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism outlined 10 principles, and they included being people-centered and inclusive, being equitable, and this idea of networked, resource, flexible, but accountability is also key in this discussion. And so that means that all stakeholders have a role to play, and they're an essential part of the solutions. But we do know that there have been challenges. There's a number of steps that can be taken. Into the digital space to include more range of stakeholders. We can build interactive dialogue through digital space like we're doing here. The private sector can be included more as part of the conversations of treaties, something that goes outside the traditional formal processes. We're seeing that right now in the intergovernmental negotiation committee processes of the plastics. We can also see that that action often takes place at levels below the national level. So we need to see local and regional governments also included in the conversation because much of the responsibility to take action will fall to them. But we do know that there are some common challenges, and we've seen that over and over again to really perform and deliver on this inclusive and network multilateralism. We have to recognize that there are enormous setbacks to these processes when the integrity of a multi-stakeholder process is drawn into question. And that comes sometimes because of a perception of lack of accountability, sometimes when it's just an imbalance between what the actual ambition needs to be and what the call to action is describing. It's when there's lack of reporting, so the information's not there, or even a perceived or a real lack of data accuracy. Either of those can be tremendous setbacks in achieving progress and building the trust that the Secretary General calls for in our multilateral systems. So we have to step into transparency with courage, and we have to courageously track the actions against the commitments and make ambitious commitments and be okay with saying that's what we're aiming for and we're going to do our best and we're going to be honest about how close we are to getting there. And the global stock take that's going to happen at this COP is part of providing that accountability. The UNFCCC, excuse me, UNFCCC Secretariat just provided a recognition and accountability framework that provides principles of engagement of governments, of data management, to ensure that we can celebrate leadership when we have great achievements. We can also ensure greater accountability as part of this process. Again, this is what builds trust. Being honest with each other, being authentic. In the draft implementation plan for the net zero pledges of non-state actors, there's proposed some concrete steps to make sure that this happens. So it's about commitments being publicly recorded for everyone to see. It's about progress being independently verified so that we know that this is real. It's about successes and best practices being recognized and shared so we can all learn from what we're able to achieve and acknowledging the challenges, acknowledging the places where we have to do better. We have a number of great examples. The Global Cooling Pledge is a great example. It's going to be featured here at COP28, and it's been championed by UAE. We're very glad to see that this raises ambitious targets to reduce cooling-related emissions. It's improving energy efficiency. UNEP has been supporting this pledge through the Cool Coalition, because achieving the pledge's targets could cut emissions by about 78 billion tons of CO2 equivalent between 2022 and 2050. This is real, measurable impact that's envisioned and that's pledged. You do this, you improve hundreds of millions of people in their lives. You actually realize at the same time huge financial benefits for governments. So what you get is a win-win-win, right? But we have to make sure that these impacts are real and that we can learn from places where there's setbacks. On the idea of inclusivity being so essential, we're seeing this in the targets of the Coming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, where we have inclusivity embedded across all of the targets. We're ensuring that Indigenous people are part of the government's decisions, part of the government's action, a part of those who share equally in the benefits we get from biodiversity, that we get from the success of the measures that we take. And finally, I'll say, of course, we need young people at the table. At the UNEP Pavilion yesterday, we had our big opening event, and we were honored to have a participant from our youth envoy from COP27 was there, and she called for empowerment of youth. The Secretary General has also done that to say we need equal voices of young people at the negotiating tables. Bring them into your delegations, give them a voice. We need their passion. We need their creativity. We need that energy that the young people have. We need their innovation. But we also need the fact that they seriously recognize that the issues, the problems that we don't resolve today is what they're going to inherit tomorrow. And so they need to be part of those conversations because they're going to be picking up the pieces. Just to conclude, I'll say that in the emission gap report that was launched this year, there's a clear message that, and we know we're hearing this across all of the discussions, we require massive and urgent shift right now to bring down greenhouse gases, and we know it's urgent, and we know you can see everything, all of the signals just walking here to the pavilion. It's about transferring commitments to action, to change. And that needs to be accelerated here in Dubai. The only way it can be done is through effective multilateralism, and that's with strength, with transparency, with inclusivity, and with accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne Gardner, for this calling for transparency and more ambitious and at the same time more mutuality with all the sector. Now we are going to give the floor to the chair of the IPCC, Mr. Chinsky, please.
Okay, thanks very much for the invite to talk at this session. And just to say, we are increasingly recognizing the important links between the three global crises of climate, nature, and pollution. Now, rather than talking about the conventions, I do want to talk about the scientific assessments and how they might link together, which I think will very much complement what we've heard already. So, just two framing thoughts. I mean, under the UNEP umbrella, there is a ready process to try to bring different assessments together. It has an acronym, AGAD, which I constantly forget, which is the Ad Hoc Global Assessment Dialogue. And that's where representatives of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, International Resources Panel, the GEO, and hopefully soon the new panel on chemicals and waste when it comes through will get together to try to progress collaboration, but also to learn from each other, because I think we each do things better than the other. And for example, just to say where IPCC can learn from IPBES on issues like the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, for example. We could make more progress there. Now, second thought and caution there is that the mandates and the procedures of the different assessments are quite distinct, and they were not necessarily designed with collaboration in mind. In fact, IPCC procedures weren't even designed with collaboration between working groups in mind, and we struggled even with the 1.5 report to hit the challenge inside the procedures that were available. So far on AGAD, we have focused on easy wins, things like working on a common glossary of terms, for example, or thinking about whether we could use common approaches to scenarios across different assessments. So, sort of softer collaboration mechanisms. And I would flag that IPCC and IPBES have run a joint workshop on biodiversity and climate. I should say the reporting of that was a little bit of a challenge for IPCC, but we won't go into that in too much detail, but we did get there. So more specifically on the content-based links, and I would say that links with IPVES have been most progressed. And I would say the scope of our working group two assessments on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability with respect to natural systems map well onto the IPBES remit. It's the same scientific communities that are feeding into both sets of assessments, and there are many overlaps in terms of authorships. And I should say the cultures are actually very much aligned. Working Group 3 on mitigation is a more interesting case. And the challenge here is obviously that some mitigation actions can have significant consequences for nature. And for example, the possible significant expansion of bioenergy in some scenarios as part of the high level of climate ambition have demonstratively proved to be contentious, and we understand that and are taking it forward. And I should say that the IPCC special report on climate change and land, which was produced in the last cycle, went a long way towards building bridges between these two approaches. On the International Resources Panel, and there are two notable areas of potential collaboration which we can work on. And one is that the contribution of resource efficiency and waste reduction to mitigation has not been quantified. And it's really important that we do understand that because it's an important part of the picture. And one of the challenges that IPCC tends to take horizontal spectral approaches to characterizing emissions, whereas within the International Resources Panel, you're much more thinking about emission reductions vertically along supply chains. And it is quite a challenge, actually, to reconcile these issues. And the second area of collaboration, I think, with the International Resources Panel is around critical materials, which has become a major issue with the rapid expansion of renewable energy and battery storage. And there are all sorts of issues that come up there around recycling, materials substitution, and the availability of resources. And I might actually add human rights issues along supply chains for critical materials as well. And the question of just transition is something that we do need to think about. An issue with IRP, the International Resources Panel, is that they are international rather than intergovernmental, which is a further issue with regard to collaboration. It means that they have a lower threshold for report approval, and that is a challenge for collaboration. And obviously, the new panel on chemicals and waste has several potential areas of contact, but we still have to explore there. We well know that chemicals and plastics derive almost exclusively from fossil fuels at the moment, and the future of the fossil fuel industry is obviously an issue that's being addressed very substantially, at this COP28. There are a couple of things that I do want to flag before finishing, and these are issues of challenge. Do governments want us to collaborate? And I have heard specific government representatives say that they don't want coordinated approaches because they would rather have the separate views of different assessments and reconcile them within the remit of their own sovereignties. So I'm not going to answer that question here, but it's obviously a question for debate. And it is a live one because certain governments have raised it. And I think the second question, which has already been raised, is the role of business and the private sector. And just to say in IPCC, the private sector has particular stakes in the findings of Working Group 3 on mitigation. That's also going to be the case for the International Resources Panel and the new Chemicals and Waste Panel. And this can prove challenges for getting reports at the approval stage. And it does raise other issues, which we've already raised with the potential chemicals and waste panel about conflicts of interest if authors potentially come from the private sector and how we guard that. And just to flag that the separate mandates of the different assessments can be guarded quite jealously by member governments. And we need to take the time to resolve some of these issues and perhaps look at softer ways of collaborating. Now, when I was campaigning to be IPCC's chair, one of my three main themes was actually interdisciplinarity. And this did refer to collaboration between IPCC's three different working groups, but also collaboration across the UN assessments. And I think I have to say I was the most engaged Bureau member in the sixth cycle when it came to this AGAD process on keeping the conversations going with the other assessments. I am fairly determined that we continue that in the seventh cycle. And what we've actually done is we've assigned individual IPCC vice chairs as focal points for each of the other UN assessments. So Ramon Peaks Madruga is going to shadow the IPBES and GEO process, while Diana Urgavorsats is going to cover the International Resources Panel. So that's just to emphasize how important we attach to this question of collaboration, and we have put in place institutional means for taking it forward. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ski. Thank you for emphasize how the EPCC plans to collaborate in bridging the gap between the different working group scientists. And thank you for these very smart questions around the collaboration between governments and scientists too. Now we are going to give the floor to Ligia Castro de Doens in representation of the Minister Milciades Concepcion, Minister of Environment of Panama.
Buen día. Voy a tratar de hablar despacio para que me puedan ayudar con la traducción. Digamos que es un reto el poder llevar en el marco de nuestras sociedades el abordaje integral que se debe hacer y multifacético de las tres crisis porque las tres crisis son interdependientes entre sí. Por tanto, su abordaje debe ser integral.
Good morning. I'm going to try to speak slowly so that the interpretation can be done efficiently. And in our legal framework, it is very important to take into account the three crises to be able to tackle these three crises because they are interlinked.
El primer reto es cómo lo abordamos desde la perspectiva de las contribuciones nacionales determinadas y las estrategias a largo plazo.
The first challenge is how we tackle them from the nationally determined contributions.
Por un lado, en cómo no solamente abordar la crisis de forma integral, sino de cómo darle una visión integrada desde la perspectiva de adaptación y mitigación.
First of all, not only how to tackle this from an integral point of view, but also to tackle this nationally determined contributions from the adaptation and mitigation perspectives.
En el caso de Panamá, estamos trabajando en un manual de soluciones basadas en naturaleza para cada uno de los 10 sectores de las contribuciones determinadas nacionalmente.
In the case of Panama, we are tackling this from the nature perspective for each of the 10 different aspects of the nationally determined contributions.
Que nos da la posibilidad no solamente de medidas de adaptación específicas basadas en estas soluciones basadas en naturaleza, sino del incremento de captura de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero.
This gives us the opportunity not only to tackle a nationally determined contribution from a nature perspective, but also to tackle the increase of greenhouse emission gases.
En este sentido, como somos país carbono negativo, hemos priorizado en el sector bosques, biodiversidad y costas y mares, fundamentalmente el incremento, conservación de esa cobertura boscosa de Panamá, que es del 68% del territorio nacional.
So the 68% of Panama's territory is covered in forests and coasts. So we have tackled this from that perspective.
En el resto de los 7 sectores, como desde la perspectiva de soluciones basadas en naturaleza, contribuimos a hacer que lleguen a la neutralidad, a carbono neutral.
So in the rest of the sectors, the rest of the 7 sectors, we contribute towards net zero emissions so that we reach net zero.
La evidencia científica nos da la base, entonces, para la toma de decisiones en cada uno de los 10 sectores, pero tiene que ser desde la perspectiva no solamente pública, privada, la academia y la sociedad civil en un esfuerzo articulado en equipo.
The perspective needs to be articulated both from the academic point of view, scientific evidence, and from the public sector as well.
Para cada uno de estos 10 sectores se va a necesitar mucho fortalecimiento de capacidades para los nuevos empleos verdes.
For each of these sectors, new green jobs need to be created to achieve this.
Pero también cómo hacer la transformación en la educación primaria, secundaria y universitaria. En la currícula educativa, aún en nuestros países, cambio climático no está transversalmente.
Also, we need to tackle this from the education sector, both at primary, secondary, and tertiary level.
En la transformación de las carreras técnicas necesitamos más carreras técnicas para los nuevos empleos verdes.
We need more technical careers for the new green jobs that are going to be created.
Por ejemplo, en el caso de energía, para las nuevas plantas eólicas, solares, incluso de hidrógeno verde, se requiere personal para la construcción, para la operación y para el mantenimiento. Y no lo tenemos en nuestros países.
For these to be happening, we need to create technical capacities for the operation, creation, and maintenance of this. And we don't have this at the moment in our countries.
O estamos graduando economistas y financistas que cuando salen van al frente de empresas, van al sistema bancario, van a los ministerios de economía y finanzas, pero nunca en su formación académica vieron cambio climático.
We have economists or people working in the finance sector that in their careers they have not talked about climate change. So when they graduate, they don't know how to tackle this.
O psicólogos, sociólogos, trabajadores sociales, psiquiatras, que nunca vieron cambio climático y que son los que tienen que atender a los desplazados climáticos.
Or we also have psychologists or psychiatrists that never tackled climate change and are the ones that need to assist those that have been displaced because of climate change.
El reto realmente es muy grande y por eso la estrategia a largo plazo en Panamá la hemos denominado estrategia socioeconómica, inclusiva, baja en emisiones y resiliente al cambio climático.
The strategy that we have started in Panama has been socioeconomic, inclusive, low in emissions in Panama.
Y que todos los sectores de la sociedad, público, privado, sociedad civil, academia, entiendan que esa estrategia a largo plazo lo que tiene que contribuir es a transformar la forma en la que estamos haciendo las cosas.
So all sectors needs to understand that this long-term strategy need to help in transforming the way in we doing things.
Y que en equipo tenemos que trabajar no solamente para la sobrevivencia de la sociedad panameña, sino para la sobrevivencia de la sociedad global.
We need to work in a team not only for the survival of Panama society, but also for the global society survival.
Muchas gracias, Ligia. Thank you very much for your words, in particular for mentioning the importance of implementing the integrated vision in society, either in formal, technical, or higher education. We have sometimes a complete absence of climate vision perspective. And thank you also to explain the socioeconomic and inclusive strategy of Panama. Now we are going to give the floor to our executive president of Philanthropy Cortes Solari, Francisca Cortes Solari. Please.
Thank you. Hoy la filantropía pasa a tener un rol fundamental para el cambio climático.
Today, philanthropy has a key role in
Nuestra-
climate change.
Nuestra experiencia de 21 años ha
Our
sido un viaje
experience
de
in 20
certeza y de errores.
Our experience of 21 years has been a journey of good and bad things that actually happened to us.
Como privado hemos querido tomar este tema como un propósito de vida y aquí estamos.
As a private, we have achieved and gathered this topic as a purpose in life. So that's where we are now.
Partimos trabajando en educación hace 21 años,
We started working in education 21 years ago,
entendiendo de que teníamos que hacer un cambio en la educación y eso nos llevó también a crear un modelo para poder trabajar con nuestros equipos.
21 years ago, we created a model in education, and that's the path that we actually been implementing for these years.
Lo interesante era ver cómo podíamos lo interesante era que este nuevo paradigma que estábamos teniendo, teníamos que poner el desafío de articular cosas que fueran diferentes e integrales.
It was a challenge because in this new paradigm, we had to implement different things that actually made a change, not keep on doing the same, because the vision is to change, to make a paradigm shift in education.
Para nosotros fue muy importante y ha sido todavía muy importante el tener este modelo en educación.
For us, it was really, really important to have this model in education,
Porque así nos aseguramos de que vayamos todos por la misma línea.
so as to ensure that we are all following the same path.
En este tiempo también nos hemos dado cuenta
In this time, in these 21 years, we also have realized
que los seres humanos necesitamos de la naturaleza
that human beings need nature
para ser felices.
to be happy.
Somos naturaleza.
We are nature.
También en Chile contamos con 3 parques, 3 reservas, 3 territorios
We count with 3 parks, 3 elemental reserves in Chile, all along Chile.
que nos ha permitido aprender mucho sobre el territorio
which allowed us to learn a lot about the territory,
y cuáles son sus necesidades
its needs from the natural point of view,
también desde los pueblos originarios
also considering the needs of the ancestral communities that live there.
y con eso, al tener estos 3 parques, nos ayudó
And actually having these 3 parks helped us
también a crear un modelo de conservación efectiva,
to create a model of effective conservation,
donde tomamos 4 dimensiones,
where we are taking 4 dimensions to consider:
que hablamos de la dimensión natural,
the natural
social,
dimension, the
cultural
social
y
dimension,
económica.
the cultural dimension, and the economic one.
Sabemos que el problema más grande que tenemos
We know that the biggest problem that we have
es que hoy día falta gobernanza
is that we lack governance
y no tenemos suficientes recursos para el cambio climático.
and we don't have enough finance and resources to tackle climate change.
Por esto que la filantropía toma un rol fundamental hoy en día
That's why philanthropy has a key role.
en estos tiempos. Personas que desinteresadamente dan parte de sus recursos para apoyar los ODS.
People who tirelessly give their own resources,
Y la
their
gran
own
problemática
time to
del
tackle these problems.
La gran problemática del mundo.
To tackle these problems not only in Chile but also around the world.
Necesitamos fortalecer gobernanza
We need to strengthen governance,
y para eso necesitamos líderes
and for that we need leaders
que no esperen más.
that stop waiting.
Finalmente, se siente como en un gran océano navegando muy solo.
We finally feel that we are in a huge ocean navigating alone.
Igual hay una esperanza porque vemos que en el último tiempo ha cambiado.
But there's a hope though, because we feel that in the end, in the last years, things are starting to change.
En mi caso,
In my particular
privado,
case, as a private,
he dado parte de mi vida,
I've
casi la
given,
mitad de mi vida,
I've given half of my life
a este trabajo.
to this job.
He dejado familia,
I've left family. She also
propio
she
bienestar.
has the family, it's not she left family. That she gave up time of family to her
my
job.
family, mi bienestar,
My well-being.
porque hemos dado todo con amor y con mucho compromiso.
But I gave it all with a lot of love and especially a lot of commitment.
Esto nos ha desafiado
This has been really
a
challenging,
crear también gobernanzas en filantropía,
but also we learned a lot because we had to create a governance inside the philanthropic institution.
hace 22 años, 20 años,
22 years ago,
no existía nada de lo que estamos hablando.
nothing of what we're talking today existed,
Y tampoco fue fácil.
and it was not an easy journey.
Hoy en día necesitamos apoyos externos,
So what I believe we need today is external support,
políticas públicas
public policies,
y organizaciones tan importantes como el IPCC, WMO y otras
And-
organizaciones
and other organizations such as IPCC, WMO, and other organizations as well.
que nos dan fuerza también a los filántropos
That
para
gives
poder
us-
continuar,
That gives us strength to us, to
porque así no nos
philanthropy, to
sentimos
keep
tan
going,
solos.
so that we don't feel alone.
Así que gracias por eso.
So thank you very much for that.
Si no hacemos algo hoy,
If we don't act today,
llegará el momento que no habrá retorno.
a time in which we
Y
cannot
todos los
come back.
esfuerzos, las palabras, los
No.
estudios
And all the efforts, the
quedarán
research, the
sumidos
study
en el pasado.
were done for nothing.
Se los pido de todo corazón
I honestly
por los
ask you
niños
for
y las niñas,
the kids,
nuestros hijos.
our kids.
Necesitamos de ecosistemas sanos porque somos naturaleza.
We need health ecosystems because we are nature.
No estamos separados de ella.
We are not aside from it.
Si los ecosistemas no están sanos, tampoco nosotros estamos sanos.
If the ecosystems are not in a healthy position, then we are not going to be in a healthy position either.
Quiero pensar, o a veces pienso,
Sometimes I think
que somos una gran nave espacial en el universo,
that we are a space rocket in the universe
donde todos convivimos en este maravilloso planeta,
where we all live together in this wonderful planet,
unos a otros para lograr los objetivos y llegar a acciones concretas y comunes.
and we need each other to come to a certain common ground to have actions that gather us together to tackle climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisca, to explain us the importance of the integration of different dimensions when we do conservation as a natural, social, economic, and cultural dimension. And also to remember that we are part of the nature at the end of the day. Now we are going to give the floor to Christian Tyrell, Program Officer of Biodiversity and Climate Change of CBD. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity, the CBD Secretariat. So, from listening to these other interventions this morning, I think from our perspective, obviously, in COP15 last year in December, there was the adoption finally of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which itself, the process of it was stretched out as a result of the pandemic. But what it helped to do, despite the difficulties with some of those negotiations because of the pandemic and the way we had to deal with it, was it allowed more time for parties and for others to really focus on some of the key issues that are driving biodiversity loss. And all the assessments leading up to the final adoption of the framework showed the devastating trend that is happening to our natural system, certainly from a biodiversity perspective, but I think also relative to climate. Just the way everything is really going in the wrong direction. And so finally in Montreal last year, there was this adoption of an ambitious framework of 4 goals, 23 targets that are supposed to help us bend the curve on biodiversity loss, put us back on track, or put us on track, frankly, towards achieving what's seen as the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Just listening to the last intervention about the importance of how we fit within this planet, the fact that we can't separate ourselves from the natural system, that our happiness, our health, our well-being is so integrated with the health of our planet, that finally the parties were able to adopt a framework that, if effectively implemented, will put us on the right track, or is expected to put us on the right track. But of course, in order to do that, we need cooperation, we need synergy at all levels, both horizontally and vertically, and a number of different things need to happen for that to actually be put in place. So just to step back a little bit, so the CBD as well as UNFCCC and UNCCD were adopted 30 years ago, or were set in motion 30 years ago. And what we're seeing is that, as in particular from a biodiversity perspective, but certainly also in terms of climate change and sustainable land management, that working on these issues, these crises in their own silos does not work. We can't take effective action in order to address these drivers, address the drivers, if we're going to tackle each one separately and try to keep them apart. And it's interesting to hear what you were saying, Jim, about how certain parties or others are shall we say, to that, to maybe put it politely. But what we're also seeing, though, at the same time, is when you look at it at a far more local level, the opportunities for success are so much stronger. So we were hearing about the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and within the CBD, they've had a very strong voice pretty much throughout the history of the convention. And part of the reason for that is that there is this recognition that in their territories, areas that they manage, that they have actual rights and recognized tenure, the biodiversity, the health of biodiversity within those areas is far stronger than in other areas. in talking in general sense here now, but what we're seeing is that there is very strong, where there is strong action and recognition of the importance of nature and taking the actions that are required, the successes are there. And we're also seeing that in other areas to a certain extent as well, at the local scale in certain urban areas and other local and sort of sub-regional areas. And that's part of the issue when you're dealing with the triple crisis of biodiversity loss, climate change, and plastic and pollution in general, is that trying to take a more sort of global overview or a larger overview really overlooks a lot of the key nuances around some of these issues and the challenges, but also the effective ways to deal with them. So coming back to the global biodiversity framework, what we saw with the previous round of targets, which were the Aichi biodiversity targets, where we're supposed to have been successfully implemented by 2020, was apart from a few. If you look at the individual targets, apart from a few areas within certain targets that were successfully done, which were largely around process, so the updating of their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, for instance, or putting in place certain processes that would be required, the actual outcomes of that did not ultimately change the trajectory on biodiversity loss. And so the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBF, is now trying to learn from those experiences and encourage parties and others, because the framework is not just for parties, it's not just for governments, certainly not just for the Ministries of Environment or whoever is tasked with dealing with biodiversity at the national level, but it's for the whole of society and the whole of government, recognizing in a very much a sort of a horizontal, sort of a lateral way, that there's a role for absolutely everyone, and vertically in terms everyone within government, and then vertically certainly within looking at it from local level action right the way up through to national and even international, is that we have to work cohesively and synergistically together. Within the framework itself, the GBF, there are a number of targets that are linked to this idea of working horizontally and vertically. So there's obviously the ones that are related to climate change and plastic and pollution. So target 7 on pollution, 8 on recognizing the driver that is climate change on biodiversity loss, and target 11, which is nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services, how we ultimately benefit, including for our health and well-being and our happiness, relating to healthy biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, etc. But then there are others. There on sectoral planning, on the role of the private sector, on sustainable consumption, negative incentives, certainly about recognizing that there are systems in place that are actively driving, whether intentionally or otherwise, biodiversity loss as well as climate change and pollution. And then mobilizing financial resources. And it was interesting to hear about the fact that the reality that there are absolute needs in terms of capacity support for governments and for others in order to do this. We know within the Paris Agreement there's the target of $100 billion a year. Within the GBF, it's $200 billion a year expected to be mobilized by 2030. But of course, that's only a small dint in terms of how much we actually need. Estimates say it's over $700 billion a year need to be mobilized in order to do this. And so the likes of philanthropic support is certainly very, very important there. And then in terms of negative incentives, we know about the level of incentives going towards supporting the fossil fuel, the use of fossil fuels. So obviously there needs to be a drastic rethinking of how governments and others are looking at this issue and working with the private sector and others in order to address that. Susan, you mentioned about knowledge and about knowing the monitoring and reporting, and knowing when we're doing the right thing and being able to adaptively manage and adjust our actions accordingly. And that's another one of the key targets. So, as I mentioned, the GBF was only adopted a year ago. It's the targets are for 2030. It's a very short time period for effective implementation, and so parties are now undergoing that revision process where they're setting their national targets in accordance and revising the action plans and the strategies in order to do that through their NBSAP, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan process. And so there are systems being put in place then to help support the implementation of that, including a NBSAP accelerator partnership, which is a bit like the NDC partnership in terms of providing support to parties and others, and the adoption and now setting in motion the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which was another key element to the decisions taken at COP15 last year. And there are a number of cross-cutting principles, of course, as well within the GBF, which are vital. One is the recognition of the human rights-based approach in all of this, that recognizing the importance of local level action, knowledge, cultures, practices, etc., and the need for them to be effectively respected by all. And so that is one of the key aspects of that. Specifically, there's mention of Indigenous peoples, local communities, but of course, it can also be broader than that. Another thing is recognizing the different values of biodiversity, not just the economic value, although that is very important to get. I suppose to put it as interest, but also concern from certain areas, and linked to that. Now we've had the adoption, the launching of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is the sort of goes hand in hand with the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Very important for those different sectors to recognize their roles within all of this, but also the intrinsic value of biodiversity. It's important for health and well-being. It's not just purely about money, although frankly money does talk. The importance of recognizing gender equality within this, intergenerational equity, and we heard about the importance of youth being a very strong voice in this. And education is another one, recognizing both formal and informal forms of education, but also education at all levels, from primary school right up through to third level. It also recognizes health specifically, although that you could put that as a legacy of the fact that it came through the pandemic, but certainly recognizing the importance of biodiversity for health. But one of the other things is the ecosystem approach, which is something that has existed within the CBD since about 2005. It's been a core part of the CBD, but it's recognizing about how you can't look at this through a small lens. You have to look at it from a broader perspective and recognize all the different the different aspects to it, the complexities that are involved, and to try and break out of these silos. Frankly, though, that's easier said than done. So there, in terms of the sort of horizontal collaboration and cooperation, there's the joint liaison group between the 3 Rio Convention secretariats. There's the biodiversity liaison group between the various biodiversity-related conventions. Now, when the plastics treaty is to be adopted, how do we formally link with the secretariat in order to try and encourage parties or governments to make sure that they are working in that sort of synergistic and effective manner. Now, those processes have existed for a long time, but certainly from the perspective of biodiversity and climate change within the CBD, and again, coming back, I don't want to say too much on this because it is quite sensitive, but within the biodiversity and climate change agenda issue within our own process, there is quite a lot of pushback from certain parties about sticking to the mandates of CBD as opposed to UNFCCC in particular, but also others for various reasons, including worries about preempting decisions taken under fora. But of course, that while understandable, there has to be that recognition of the links between them, because, as I say, we can't continue to work in isolation and in silos. So I'll just finish to say, from the CBD side, we certainly welcome the IPBES IPCC co-sponsored workshop on biodiversity and climate change, as well as just the fact that nature was so prominent within the 6th assessment cycle under IPCC. And we're seeing that here now within the UNFCCC process, building on the last couple of COPs, but in particular in this one is just the level of recognition and importance being put on nature as being as it needed to be recognized in all its forms, and not just specifically talking about forests as carbon sinks, but also from an adaptation perspective, the importance of recognizing the value of nature. And that is a very positive sight to see, and we hope to help uh, strengthen that, not just within negotiations here, but also when governments go home, and as I say, as they go through their MBSAP revision process, etc., and of course in terms of implementation. We're now at the end of 2023. These targets under the GBF need to be effectively achieved by 2030. It's a very short period of time. We need the resources being provided, financial resources certainly, but also technology and capacity and knowledge, etc., in order to address biodiversity loss, address climate change, address pollution, and these things, as I say, ad nauseum at this point, but we can't be working in silos. We need to be working together and synergistically, and we look forward to working with everyone to help move things forward in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tristan, to remind us the urgency of achieving the 30-30 goals and the need to partner, fundraise, and move fast, very fast. And we also like a lot the human-based approach that you mentioned, together with the native tradition approach you mentioned, gender equality, education, and so on. Now we are going to give the floor to Charlotte, who is watching us somewhere. Charlotte is in Denmark. She's the director program of the Velux Foundation. She was a masterpiece in the organization of several of the panels that we are here, that we are going to present during those 2 weeks. So thank you very much, Charlotte. She couldn't come, unfortunately, for the very last event, but thank you for all your help, and I give you the floor.
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do.
Yes. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for intervention and again for your help. I have a lot of questions now for you, and I hope you will be available to talk about you. My first question is for you, Jim. You left an open question about whether governments are willing and able to coordinate with each other. And I was wondering what science could do, at least from the EPCC, considering that many scientists sometimes, with all my due respect, work from a competitive perspective because they have sometimes to fight for funds and so on. It happens a lot, in South America. So where you don't have regular funds for scientists. So what can we do in order to help science to show us an integrated perspective that could help policymakers to make the difference?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, even within IPCC, it is a very big challenge to bring different scientific communities together because the cultures, frankly, of our three working groups are very different. And in fact, I would see quite a strong overlap between the scientific cultures of those involved in IPBES and those involved in the natural system aspects of Working Group 2, especially on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. So in some ways, the collaboration is there. We can work together, and scientists are willing to work together. I think the bigger challenge actually lies within in some of the perhaps the institutional obstacles that I've mentioned a bit and has also been mentioned there. That is where the big challenges that are. I think scientists are ready to work together. I honestly don't think competition for funding is actually an issue there in terms of support for actual scientific research. It's more I would put the focus on the institutional side.
Thank you, Jim. And Susan, in that regard, how can we do in order to help national government to include a deeper collaboration of different sectors and then to include their voices in the multilateralism?
Well, one of the things that is incentivized in the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework is that governments really look at the kinds of policies that are driving the wrong kinds of actions and begin to shift those. For example, transitioning subsidies from activities that actually harm nature and biodiversity to actually nature positive subsidies. So it doesn't mean that there'll be less support for industry. It means there will be more support that incentivizes industry to do positive things that actually has a long-term benefit for communities and populations. And so as governments look at the policies, the value of the natural resources, not just as the commodities of the cost of a tree, but actually as the enormous, invaluable services that are provided from the ecosystem as a forest, then we can begin to have better economic models and better planning, better incentives to ensure that the long-term vision of how governments are driving and incentivizing businesses are in place for achieving the commitments that we have already outlined through the various conventions.
Thank you very much. Now I have a question for Ligia. Te la hago en español, Ligia, and you traduce, please. Ligia, Panamá ha sido un país bastante destacado en desarrollar una política oceánica muy integral, no solo nacional, sino también internacional con otros países. ¿Cómo han logrado poner puntos con sus países vecinos en materia justamente oceánica y destacar en esa materia?
Bueno, no fue fácil, pero
I was asking,
no fue fácil, pero se hizo la tarea.
So that you can translate the question.
Okay.
So Panama has had a long history of having policies where integrating the ocean policies. What can you tell us about this?
Sí, la primera tarea fue cómo incrementábamos, así como ya teníamos 68% de cobertura boscosa en tierra firme, cómo incrementábamos las áreas protegidas marinas panameñas, que eran muy pocas.
So the first task, how we were implementing the marine areas in Panama that were very, very little.
En este momento tenemos el 53% del territorio marino como áreas de conservación.
At this very moment, we have 53% of the marine territory as a conservation area.
Y lo conseguimos 9 años antes del acuerdo que se había llevado a cabo del 30 por 30.
And we managed to do this 9 years before that, when the agreement of 30 by 30 was made.
Se requirió lograr primero los consensos nacionales entre el sector público, privado, academia, sociedad civil, los pescadores. Fue difícil incorporarlos y que lo entendieran, pero los pudimos sumar.
We managed to do this public consensus also with the private sector, with academia, with professional. It was difficult to struck this agreement with fishers, but we managed to do so in the long term.
Y luego el compartir esa experiencia con nuestros países vecinos, que pudieran también entender que se podría asumir el reto y que podríamos ir por más que el 30 por 30.
And then this agreement had to be reached with our neighboring countries, the fact that we could go further than that, more than the 30 by 30 challenge.
Y de esta forma logramos consolidar la alianza del corredor marino mesoamericano, con el cual estamos trabajando muy activamente.
And with this agreement, we managed to achieve the Mesoamerican corridor, which is what we're working on at the moment.
Ahora el nuevo reto es cómo conseguir entre estos 4 países un plan de trabajo común para ese corredor marino mesoamericano.
Now the challenge resides in how to achieve a common working framework for those 4 countries that are working in that Mesoamerican corridor.
Una sola política, un solo plan, que lo trabajemos articulados entre todos los países.
One only policy, one plan that is articulated amongst the 4 countries.
Allí está el mayor reto para la concertación.
That's where the biggest challenge for conservation resides.
Thank you very much. Now I have a question for Charlotte. Charlotte, if you can hear me, you have a lot of experience in multilateral negotiation, in politics, and now in the philanthropic world. So, in your opinion, what are the main challenges for philanthropy in order to enhance multilateralism in conservation?
I think there is a lot of
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Now I have a question for Francisca. Francisca, te quería preguntar sobre cuál es la importancia de los pueblos originarios en el alcance de una gobernanza que sea realmente integral y sustentable. Yes, I was asking Francisca about the importance of native people in order to achieve a governance, a sustainable governance.
Dentro de la educación, nosotros tenemos un territorio donde están los pueblos originarios, en la latitud 22 en San Pedro de Atacama.
In our philanthropic institution, we, as I mentioned before, we have 3 territories. One of which is located in the north in San Pedro Atacama in latitude 22, where the communities of ancestors' knowledge are actually living there.
Creo que ha sido el desafío más grande trabajar con los pueblos originarios en estos 23 años.
In our 23 years, working with indigenous people has been our highest and biggest challenge.
Pero finalmente creando confianza, a ellos les interesa mucho la confianza.
But through creating trust, which is a key point for them,
Y eso se crea con el
we actually
y con
achieved it.
cosas y eventos que sean concretos.
And that has to do basically with time and with concrete actions that demonstrate that trust is possible among
Desde
us.
Filantropía Cortés Solari,
From Philanthropy Cortés Solari,
después de haber trabajado mucho tiempo con los pueblos originarios,
after working with them for so long,
pensamos que son muy importantes para el cambio climático,
we consider that they are key for climate
porque
change
son ellos los que tienen la memoria de lo que es la sobrevivencia.
because basically it's them the ones who have the memoir, reminding of how to survive.
Ellos saben cómo cultivar la tierra.
They know how to deal with the ground and cultivate the land.
Ellos saben cuándo a través de la luna se planta o
Ye-
se recoge
Exactly.
los frutos.
Through the change of the moon and considering climate and different conditions, they know when it's the exact time to plant or not, according to the weather,
Son los guardianes para mí o para nosotros de la semilla
They are the gardens of the seeds.
y del alimento.
So, of the food.
Yes. Creemos que cada vez más hay más interés en los pueblos originarios.
The increase of interest in communities, in ancestral communities, has been, developing in the last few years. And let me mention that we were the first institution to come to bring to COP the ancestral communities during COP25.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Espérate, me perdí.
Okay.
¿Sí?
No. It's okay. That
Yes.
yes. That the thing is that it has been increasing, ha ido aumentando el interés en las
Interés,
comunidades
yes.
originarias justamente por eso. It has been increasing the interest of in ancestral communities due to that, their context and how they could survive and deal.
Lo que creemos en el fondo que en algún momento llegarán los pueblos originarios
What we
a preguntarle a los líderes del mundo cómo hacerlo.
What we believe is that it will come a time in which the leaders of the world are going to ask the indigenous communities how to do it.
Porque ellos sí saben hacerlo.
Because they do know how to do it, because they have already done it.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisca. And now, Tristana, I have a last question for you. How far are we from developing an institutional framework for the high sea? It's a very important matter for us in Patagonia that will enable humanity to be endowed with comprehensive and holistic governance.
Sorry, could you repeat the last?
Yes, how far? We know that after the agreements of last year, we need to create an institutionality or framework to deal with the IC, and it involve the participation of all the country, and this is a major thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I thought you said manatees, and I suddenly think I need to be quite specific. Yes, so obviously there's the DBF last year, and I heard about the 30 by 30 target 3 on increasing protected areas, including outside areas of national jurisdiction. There's also the High Seas Treaty, which has been finally now coming to a point where it's being actually adopted. But it's the actual management of these areas that is going to be fundamental. And protected areas, as such, have a long history in terms of being an avenue of conservation and management of biodiversity, with varying degrees of success. In some places, they are carefully considered, planned, and then there is support to effectively manage those areas once they're in place. In other areas, they are literally just a line on a map that has been decided. Okay, we're going to designate that area as a protected area, but actually, there's no ongoing effective management of it. One of the issues with the high seas is that because they are so far from actual land as such, where people are, and ensuring that there's effective observation, monitoring, and patrolling, governance of those areas is going to be key. And of course, the institutional frameworks at various levels, including at the national level, but also at the international level, the support networks need to be put in place. In terms of how far we are from that, it depends very much on particular regions, particular areas, relative to various countries. There are some areas that are far more engaged, recognizing the value of those areas because of their own particular context. So in the Pacific Islands region, there's been a lot more focus on it, just given the legacy of the importance of those areas than in other areas. We're also seeing things like the Antarctic Treaty coming to a point now where it's coming to a point where it needs to be renegotiated again. What is going to happen in terms of governance around that? How's that institutional framework going to continue to go forward in the next years? It's a difficult one to put in to sort of generalize about if you're looking at it at the global level. But of course, just coming back to some of the issues around the financing, that obviously is essential. And so there's obviously a role for philanthropic organizations in order to support that. But you need to have willingness, understanding, and active engagement from governments and others in order for that to be effective. and there needs to be a proper coordination and understanding amongst all the different stakeholders for that to happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christian. I don't know if someone want to do another question. Sonia?
Thank you. Well, the first, thank you for all of your intervention. This is a great panel. Thank you for that. And in this sense, I have a question for Susan, because in this intervention, we don't talk about the plastic treaty. So, if it's possible, uh, um, what can you tell us about the negotiations on the plastic treaty? And if you can tell us how far or how close are we to achieving the goals of this historic plastic treaty? Thank you.
Well, you know, the INC on plastic that was established at UNEA 4 um, was created with huge ambition. Ambitious in terms of the timing to complete the negotiations by this time next year, to ensure that it was a multi-stakeholder process. I mean, when you look at the resolution from UNEA that launched the INC, the negotiating committee for plastics treaty, it was very clear that it was ambitious, that it included the whole life cycle of plastics. So, all the way from design of products to the types of chemicals and compounds and the toxicity of those compounds that are going to be used to produce plastics. That's an enormously large task. You know, one of the things that was very important in this process was that a whole range of stakeholders were included in these discussions because the plastics problem is not going to be solved just by governments deciding together on their own and, you know, saying it shall be. It requires solutions that come from the private sector that are currently designing these products. We heard a lot, for example, from food packaging industry, who were extremely supportive of having multilateral discussions about plastic packaging, as long as it was mandatory. And it was very interesting. They wanted to see a legally binding, still want to see a legally binding agreement because they have the challenges of trying to produce their products in a global, to global markets, where every country has different regulations. Some countries you see different regulations at the state or provincial level. So that has helped a lot. The fact that industry, private sector, NGOs, everyone who has knowledge of the situation has been brought into the conversation has been essential for really identifying solutions that will work to meet the ambition that we have. This is INC3 just ended last week or the week before. They have now, you know, the draft that is getting everybody's focus. As these processes go, I was personally involved in the INC process for Mercury, and those drafts, as we know, they get messier before they get cleaner. It's just the way it is. That if you have a process like that, then you know you're being inclusive because you're hearing perspectives that allow more people in the conversation. It means that that draft is going to reflect more different points of views. And then little by little, over time, with many, many late nights, the negotiators are going to get to the point where they can all agree. And that's where this process is heading very quickly. And now to get a really good answer, I would give you the chance to talk to the INC Secretariat at UNEP, and they're the ones that. So this is not something within the mandate of the Ecosystems Division. So I can't speak with authority, as a director of the Ecosystems Division, but only to give you my perspective in UNEP as what I'm seeing from how this progress is unfolding. My pleasure.
Thank you very much. I have a last question for you, Jim. You mentioned, I think, twice about the importance of the youth and the indigenous knowledge in the participation of the report. So I would like to have your comments about how the EPCC is integrating the youth and the indigenous knowledge?
Yeah. Well, really two strands on this. And again, in Working Group 2 on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, the importance of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge has been thoroughly recognised. I think for the next cycle, there are two kind of signals that we're trying to send. Is one that we do need to pay a lot of attention to author selection so that we can tap into Indigenous knowledge in appropriate ways. And secondly, at a slightly higher level, we have had engagement with the major constituencies at UNFCCC, particularly the ENGOs, the environmental NGOs, and the BINGOs, the business and industry NGOs. And one of my ambitions would be to expand that to include other major constituencies as well. So we have the Indigenous peoples organisations on our list there, and I am having a meeting with them later during this COP to understand and progress that collaboration. So that's how we plan to do it, but it's work in progress.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, everyone, and Charlotte from Denmark. And see you soon. Hope again. Bye.
You gather for the final picture.